The law of dependent arising. The secret to bondage and release. Sermon 2. By Bhikkhu K, Ñāṇananda. Narrated by Bhikkhu Candana. Sermon 2. Pahankanuwa Sermon number 184. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Homage be to the Fortunate One, the Worthy, fully enlightened. Kuto sara nivattanti, Katha vartaṃ navartati, Katha namancha rupancha, Asesaṃ uparujjhati. Yatha apocha pathavi, Tejo vayo nagadhati. Ato sara nivattanti, Etha vattaṃ na vattati, Etha namancha rupancha, Asesaṃ uparujjhati. Sara Sutta, Devata Sangyutta. Wherefrom do currents turn back? Where whirls no more the whirlpool? Wherein does name and form get cut off with no trace left? Where water, earth, fire, and air are unplumbed and find no footing, herefrom do currents turn back. Here whirls no more the whirlpool. Here it is that name and form get held in check, with no trace left. Dear listeners, the fully enlightened Buddha made known to the world that samsaric existence is a cyclic process, in that it is a going the same round again and again. That indeed is the true meaning of the term saṅsara varta. The two significant words, saṅsarana and nissarana, are also suggestive of a going round and an exit from the vicious circle, the release. When one keeps going round and round for an inconceivably long period of time, one tends to build up a tension or an impulse to continue the process. That is what makes it extremely difficult to get out of the cyclic process. What the fully enlightened one proclaimed to the world through the law of dependent arising is the cause of this cyclic process and the way of getting out of it. The two verses we have taken up as the topic of our sermon today also deals with these two aspects of running round, saṅsarana, and exit from the round, the centripetal and the centrifugal aspects. These two verses are found in the Devata Sangyutta of the Sangyutta Nikaya. The first verse embodies a deep Dhamma question raised by a deity in the Buddha's presence. The second verse has the Buddha's answer to it. Let us try to get a general idea of the meaning of the two verses. Kuto sara nivattanti, katha vattaṃ navattati. From where do currents turn back? Where does the whirlpool not whirl? Katha namancha rupancha, Asesaṃ uparujjhati. Where does name and form get cut off without residue? This is the question posed by the deity, and here is the Buddha's reply. Yatha apocha pathavi, tejo vayo nagadhati, where water and earth, fire and air find no footing. Ato sara nivattanti, it is from there that currents turn back. Etha vattang navattati, it is here that the whirlpool does not whirl. Etha namancha rupancha asesang uparujhati, it is here that name and form get cut off without residue. You all might have understood that these are two riddle verses. It seems the most important word in the two verses is vatta, round. The word vatta also has the sense of turning round or going round. Here the turning round is that of water currents. That is why we brought up a simile of a vortex in our explanation of the law of dependent arising. It is not something contrary to the Buddha's teaching. But unfortunately, if you look up the standard canonical translations in Sinhala for the meaning of this riddle verse, you will find something like this. Katha vattang navattati, where does samsaric rain not rain? This talk about rain obfuscates a deep aspect of the law of dependent arising. On this subject, we have spoken a lot in our sermons. In our last sermon, too, we referred to the simile of the vortex. Today I shall explain it in detail. Let us try to understand how a whirlpool or a vortex comes to be formed. The main stream of water in a river usually flows downwards, but some runaway current of water rather pervertly or arbitrarily tries to run against the main stream. It is trying to do something impossible. So after going a little way, it clashes with the main stream, gets thrown off, turns round and pushed on by the main stream, makes a vain attempt to go forward. Due to this vain attempt, which every time gets foiled, a whirlpool or a vortex is formed with the passage of time. As if because it fails to go forward, it starts moving downward in a revolving fashion due to the resulting tension. It goes on digging towards the bottom deeper and deeper until an abyss is formed. As you know, where there is a whirlpool, there is an abyss. Along with the formation of an abyss, something else happens. A vacuum is created on the surface water by the funnel-like churning motion downward. To fill this vacuum, the whirlpool develops a dangerous power of attraction. That is why a swimmer is always apprehensive of a whirlpool. It attracts whatever that comes within its orbit. This power of attraction is comparable to grasping, upadana. If the vacuum it tries to fill is craving, tanha. This peculiar behavior of a whirlpool makes it a center of activity, a unit. Wherever there is a whirlpool in a river, one can point it out as a here and a there. If we take this whirlpool or vortex in a metaphorical sense, we can interpret its formation this way. The nature of the world is impermanence, but beings have in them 4 perversions. 1. Perception of permanence in the impermanent. 2. Perception of beauty in the repulsive. 3. Perception of happiness in the painful. And 4. Perception of self in the not-self. Because of the ignorance, avidya, represented by the 4 perversions, some impelling force of preparations, sankhara, moves forward. Where it fails to go forward, it turns round and, as we have already explained, gives rise to a whirlpool or vortex. It is the preparations that sustain the vortex. So then, the role of ignorance and preparations, sankhara, can explain the interrelation between consciousness and name and form, which we compared to a vortex. Very often, we had to point out that name and form has to be understood differently and not as it is explained nowadays. To put it briefly, name in name and form is only a formal name, and form in name and form is only a nominal form. Feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention are the factors on the mental or name side, with which the four great primaries, earth, water, fire, and air, are recognized. That is why they are collectively called name. By that recognition, a perception of form comes up, which in effect is a form only in name. So this vortex is something spurious. In fact, even the term sankhara has connotations of spuriousness or deceptiveness, as, for instance, in its association with the drama. The motive force of preparations aroused by ignorance keeps up the vortical interplay between consciousness and name and form. In our last sermon, we pointed out with illustrations like the chess game and the dog on the plank, how the activity of the vortex gives rise to a duality which sustains the illusion of existence. In short, the vortex gives a perverted notion of an actual existence. That is what we meant by a here and a there, giving a false impression of existence in a flowing river. Through those similes, we tried to present the basic facts underlying the law of dependent arising. In drawing out the implications of this simile further, let us not forget that the Buddha compared consciousness to a magical illusion. Consciousness has the quality of reflection, as in the case of water. Because of its quality of reflection, name and form are reflected on it. The world takes it to be real, mistaking it to be an actual name and an actual form is the beginning of all the confusion. We described this bifurcation into two sides as a competition with the chess game and the cricket match as illustrations. As a simple illustration, we gave the simile of the dog on the plank, which, it seems, has now become popular among preachers. More recently, we gave another simile, which many would relish. It is about the handsome Greek youth Narcissus, borrowed from Greek literature. Narcissus had never seen his own face. One day, while wandering in a forest, he bent down into a pond to wash his face. Seeing his own face as a reflection, he imagined an angel in the water and tried to embrace her. Because of the ripples, he kept on repeating his vain attempt, and finally pined away and died. We gave this simile to show that the interplay between consciousness and name and form is something similar. Then how can one liberate oneself from this predicament? That is the problem before us now. This is not a problem we have introduced ourselves. There are a number of discourses preached by the Buddha himself, which mention this interrelation between consciousness and name and form. Anya manya paccayata, mutual conditionality. The way of freedom from this vortex is clearly portrayed in the Mahapadana Sutta. In that discourse, our Buddha relates how Vipassi Buddha in the distant past attained Buddhahood. He did not go through a period of rigorous austerities like our Gautama Buddha. Instead, when the time was ripe for his attainment, he used radical attention to understand, by stages, the law of dependent arising. Starting from the very end, he went on tracing the causes for existence until he came to the mutual conditionality between consciousness and name and form. Briefly stated, his way of attending proceeded as follows. Given what does decay and death come to be? Conditioned by what is decay and death? As you all know, decay and death is the last among the 12 links. It is the way of radical attention, or yoniso manasikara. The meaning of the term yoniso manasikara should be properly understood. To analyze the word yoni means the matrix or the place of origin. So yoniso manasikara is attention by way of the matrix, the point of origin. In short, it means reflection as to the causes and conditions. First of all, he thought, when what is there does decay and death come to be? Dependent on what is decay and death? Then it occurred to him, when birth is there, decay and death comes to be. Dependent on birth is decay and death. In the same way, he directed radical attention further and thought, when what is there does birth come to be? Dependent on what is birth? When existence is there, does birth come to be? Dependent on existence is birth. This is because birth is the beginning of existence. Only when there is a concept of existence can there be a concept of birth. Then he thought, given what does existence come to be? Dependent on what is existence? And he understood. Given grasping does existence come to be? Dependent on grasping is existence. Going by the same mode of radical attention, he thought of the condition for grasping and found craving, and likewise the condition of craving to be feeling, condition of feeling to be contact, condition for contact to be the 6 sense spheres. What is called 6 sense spheres is sometimes spoken of as 12 spheres. Then one has to understand by it the 6 internal spheres, i.e. the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind, and the 6 external spheres, i.e. the forms, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, the tangibles, and the ideas. Taken as pairs, they are the 6 spheres of sense. It is because of these spheres that contact comes to be. Then he thought, what being there does the 6-fold sense spheres come to be? What is the condition for the 6-fold sense sphere? It occurred to him then, when name and form is there, does the 6-fold sense sphere come to be? Name and form is the condition for the 6-fold sense sphere. Going further, he thought, what being there does name and form come to be? What is the condition for name and form? He understood that it is when consciousness is there that name and form comes to be. That consciousness is the condition for name and form. Then he pondered, what being there does consciousness come to be? What is the condition for consciousness? He realized that it is when name and form is there that consciousness comes to be. That name and form is the condition for consciousness. With that, he was convinced of the interdependence of these 2 links. It is said that at this point it occurred to the Bodhisattva Vipassi. Paccūdāvat Vattati ko idang viññāṇaṃ nama rūpamha nāparang gacchati. This consciousness turns back from name and form. It does not go to another. This is how he aroused the knowledge of the arising nature of things. On reaching that point in his radical attention, it occurred to him. This consciousness does not go beyond name and form. Dependent on name and form is consciousness, and dependent on consciousness is name and form. From there he reflected back. Dependent on name and form is 6 sense spheres. Dependent on 6 sense spheres, contact. Dependent on contact, feeling. Dependent on feeling, craving, and so on, ending with the conclusion, this is the arising of this entire mass of suffering. This then is the arising aspect of suffering. With that understanding, it is said that the Bodhisattva Vipassi exclaimed, Samudayo, Samudayo, arising, arising. At this juncture, the Bodhisattva Vipassi is said to have made an utterance of joy, as we get in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, in the case of our Gautama Buddha. Chakkhung udapadi ñāṇaṃ udapadi paññā udapadi vijja udapadi āloko udapadi. The eye arose, the knowledge arose, the wisdom arose, the science arose, the light arose. That is as regards the arising aspect. Along with it, the Bodhisattva Vipassi attended to the cessation aspect, and that too starting from the end. When what does not exist, does decay and death not come to be? With the cessation of what does the cessation of decay and death come to be? And he understood. When there is no birth, decay and death does not come to be. With the cessation of birth comes cessation of decay and death. I hope you all can understand the reverse order in the same way. When what does not exist, does birth not come to be? With the cessation of what does the cessation of birth come to be? When there is no existence, birth does not come to be. With the cessation of existence comes cessation of birth. Likewise, when grasping ceases, existence or becoming would cease. When craving ceases, grasping would cease. When feeling ceases, craving would cease. When contact ceases, feeling would cease. When the 6 sense spheres cease, contact would cease. When name and form ceases, the 6 sense spheres would cease. When consciousness ceases, name and form would cease. When name and form ceases, consciousness would cease. With this, again, he reached the point at which the interrelation between consciousness and name and form became obvious. Then the Bodhisattva Vipassi is said to have uttered this highly significant statement. Adhigato ko miyāyang vipassana maggo bodhāya. The way of insight to awakening has been aroused by me. This clearly indicates that the law of dependent arising, which in our tradition has been almost relegated to the limbo, is directly relevant to meditation and helpful for enlightenment. After understanding the cessation aspect, the Bodhisattva Vipassi exclaimed that the way of insight has been aroused because it is the decisive aspect in regard to insight. The reason is that along with the cessation of name and form, the 6 sense spheres cease, and with that, contact, feeling, and craving also cease. Thus, the entire mass of suffering comes to cease. What comes after this is only the following information. The Bodhisattva Vipassi, with the help of this mode of insight, reflected on the rise and fall of the 5 aggregates of grasping as follows. Thus is form, thus its arising, thus its passing away. Thus is feeling, thus its arising, thus its passing away. Thus is perception, thus its arising, thus its passing away. Thus are preparations, thus their arising, thus their passing away. Thus is consciousness, thus its arising, thus its passing away. Finally, it is said that having contemplated on the rise and fall of the 5 aggregates, before long he attained enlightenment. We can form some idea of the way of reflection in insight meditation by this account. What is meant by the contemplation of the rise and fall, Udayabbhaya, is the contemplation of the arising and ceasing nature of phenomenon. In contemplating on arising and ceasing, the question of causes and conditions comes up as a matter of course. As we mentioned the other day, according to discourses like Mahapunnama Sutta, the cause and condition for form is the 4 great primaries, namely earth, water, fire, and air. The cause and condition for feeling is contact. The cause and condition for perception is contact. The cause and condition for preparations is contact. But the cause and condition for consciousness is name and form. We can infer that the Bodhisattva Vipassi, in his contemplation of rise and fall of the 5 aggregates of grasping, reflected lastly on consciousness, and thereby became acquainted with name and form. As the radical attention on name and form became sharper and sharper, he realized the cessation of preparations and attained enlightenment. From our analysis of this discourse, it should be obvious how important the law of dependent arising is. Generally, we talk only about the 4 noble truths, but from this episode, it is clear that when one examines the causes and conditions of consciousness, one would hit upon name and form. Let me elaborate a little on this point. However much we explain, it seems there are many who cannot budge an inch from the traditional interpretation. So often I have pointed out, with special reference to the Buddha's own definition found in the discourses, that the factors on the name side in name and form are feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention. It is with the help of these 5 that we recognize the 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and air, in terms of hard and soft, hot and or cold, and so forth. That is why it is called rupa sanya, perception of form. Those 5 factors are called name only in a formal sense. Primarily, recognition is not by name in the conventional and linguistic sense, but by means of feeling, perception, intention, contact, and attention. Some confuse the issue by arguing that contact has to precede feeling. However much we point out with quotations, they insist on putting contact first. Let me explain it in such a way that at least you all would not forget. Please stretch your right hand if you can. Now stretch out the fingers. I'm going to give you an exercise to drive out sleepiness, if any. Now stretch your palm. All right. Start counting your fingers. 1. What is the finger you bend? Is it the thumb? Isn't it the little finger? This is how I call the small but mischievous little finger, feeling. Then comes number 2, the ring finger where you wear the signet ring. Well, call it perception. Now for number 3. Bend the decisive middle finger, prominent and intrusive. See how it digs into your palm. Let us call it intention. He is the one who calls the waiter and silences a meeting. You do your work when intention steps in. Number 4 is the index finger, fussy and busy all the time. You may dub it contact. What comes last as number 5? The thumb. Standing apart but approachable to the rest, as lexicons define it. Take it as attention. So have this at your fingertips, this definition of name. When you clutch your fingers, the one nearest to your thumb, i.e. attention, is the index finger, i.e. contact. Well, that is why I prefer the original sutta definition of nāma. Of course, these similes are not found in the discourse. I brought these up only for clarification. Now, after this, at least you all, dear listeners, must not doubt the Buddha word regarding nama in Namarupa. To impress you further on this point, let me say something more. There may be in this audience lawyers and other knowledgeable persons who know more about legal matters. I have heard that there is provision for such a tactic as this in legal affairs. Sometimes a case of murder or theft comes up in the law courts, with no one to give evidence. When there is no evidence, the accused has to be discharged. In such circumstances, our legal system has provision for a tactic like this. Suppose there are 5 persons accused in a case of planned theft of a very serious type, but no one comes forward to give evidence. In such a situation, the judge can give pardon to one of the alleged culprits under the oath. You must tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thereby, that culprit is persuaded to give evidence holding nothing back. Now mind you, the Buddha himself resorted to such a middle path tactic. The magical illusion of consciousness is an insoluble problem. This problem, which no one in the world, not even the seers, could solve, the Buddha successfully solved through his middle path. It is to illustrate this mode of solution that I employ this simile. I don't know much about law, but this much I know, so let me explain now. We identified thumb with attention. He is the guy who, in the guise of a non-radical attention, ayoniso manasikara, led us up the garden path and brought us all this long way in samsara. He has dubious relations with the little finger, feeling, the ring finger, perception, with the middle finger, intention, and above all, with the index finger, contact. As a matter of fact, he is closely associated with the fussy and busy index finger. The Buddha understood that out of the whole bunch, the biggest, even in size, is the thumb, attention. He is the guy who, as a non-radical attention, planned the whole crime. So what did the Buddha do? He converted non-radical attention into radical attention, insisting on the confession of the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That is how the Buddha adjudicated this mysterious case of consciousness. To pull all this in a nutshell, let us go back to the dog on the plank. That dog keeps on looking down into the water because of non-radical attention. If it suddenly understands, it is not that I look because I see, but that I see because I look, it will no longer go on looking. Then there is the story of Narcissus. We have cited in our books. In fact, we gave a revised version of that story about the handsome Greek youth, Narcissus. In the original story, it is said that he fell in love with the reflection of his own face in the pond, mistaking it to be an angel's, and sacrificed his life for the imagined angel, and that a flower nearby his dead body was named after him. That was all. But we revised the story and made a Buddhist version of it. We resurrected the youth and got him to realize the fact that it is his own reflection that he is in love with, that he is seeing because he looks. But this is only our postscript to the story. If that youth had actually aroused that radical attention, he could have become a stream winner. Well, all this is to show that attention is the most important factor. That is why, with the change from non-radical attention to radical attention, everything became clear to the Buddha. Let us pass on to another story. Some of you might not like those Greek stories. Well, we have our Jataka stories. Among the Jataka stories, there is one called Ummagga Jataka, a fairly long story. There we have an interesting and instructive story titled The Gem Problem. I shall try to relate it in brief. King Vedeha of Mithila was informed that there is a gem in the pond by the city gate. The king asked his senior-most advisor, Seneca, to procure it. He went there and looked into the pond. True enough, there was a gem. So he got the people to empty the pond to get it. But they couldn't find the gem. Then he ordered them to dig out the mud, but all in vain. However, when the pond got filled again, the elusive gem was still there. Again and again he got the people to empty the pond, but no one could trace it. At last he reported the matter to the king, who then entrusted that duty to his youngest adviser, Bodhisattva Mahosaddha. Wise as he was, as soon as he looked into the pond, understood that it is only a reflection, and that the gem must be in the crow's nest on the palm tree by the pond. In the presence of the king, who also came there, he got a bowl full of water immersed into the pond. A gem was visible there too. "Where then is the gem?" asked the king. "It is in the crow's nest up there, Lord," replied Mahosaddha, and got it down for the king. So this is a good illustration for non-radical attention, ayoniso manasikara. Seneca imagined a gem in the pond and dug out the mud. To Bodhisattva Mahosaddha's wisdom eye, it appeared only as a reflection on water. By the way, there is a certain detail in this episode, which, curiously enough, has a deeper dimension. As you remember, in the 2 verses that formed the topic of our sermon, there was the question, wherefrom do currents turn back? Where whirls no more the whirlpool? Wherein does name and form get cut off with no trace left? And what was the Buddha's answer? Where water, earth, fire, and air are unplumped and get no footing. Herefrom do currents turn back. Here whirls no more the whirlpool. Here it is that name and form get held in check with no trace left behind. Now, what does this mean? Where the 4 great primaries, earth, water, fire, and air, do not get a footing, that is to say, do not get established, it is from there that the currents turn back. So far, in our commentarial tradition, no one could understand the import of the riddle verse and the Buddha's answer to it. Even from the episode we have just related, you can get a clue to it. According to Seneca's sight, there was a gem in the pond. Therefore, a gem got established in earth, water, fire, and air. But to Mahosaddha's insight, it appeared merely as a reflection. So there was no need to dig into the pond to find it. Now, from that point onwards, let me sidetrack to another discourse, which is also relevant to our topic. It is the Kevadha Sutta of the Digha Nikaya. It is an extremely deep sutta, which has puzzled many a scholar. It embodies a wonderful episode which the Buddha relates to a certain householder. According to it, a certain monk, whose name is not given, conceived a problem which is of the type that modern scientists are concerned with. Where do these four great primaries, earth, water, fire, and air, cease without residue? He seems to have thought that there must be some place where they completely cease. He did not approach the Buddha to get an answer. Instead, because he had developed psychic powers, he went from heaven to heaven seeking an answer to his problem from the gods. They said, "We do not know. Go and ask those in higher heavens." Passing from heaven to heaven and from Brahma world to Brahma world, finally he put his question to Maha-Brahma. He was shy to confess his ignorance in the company of Brahmas. So he cautioned that monk to his side and confided, "I myself do not know the answer. But why did you come all this way? You should have asked the Buddha himself." Then that monk came back to the Buddha and posed his question. Where do those four great primaries, earth, water, fire, and air, cease without residue? The Buddha, however, instead of answering the question as it is, remarked, "Monk, that is not the way you should put the question. This is how you should word it. Kata apocha patavi, tejo vayo nagadhati. Kata digancha rassancha anungthulang subhasubhang. Kata namancha rupancha asesang uparujjati." Where do water and earth, fire and air find no footing? Where do long and short, subtle and gross, comely and ugly, and name and form get held in check with no trace left? First of all, let us try to understand the significance of the Buddha's reformulation of the question. Kata apocha patavi, tejo vayo nagadhati. Here too we have the word gadhati, to find a footing. Where do water and earth, fire and air find no footing? It is not a question of destruction or complete cessation, but a case of getting not established by not finding a footing. Then there are these significant words too. Kata digancha rassancha anungthulang subhasubhang. Kata namancha rupancha asesang uparujjati. Where do the distinctions like long and short, subtle and gross, comely and ugly, and name and form get held in check with no trace left? Instead of the word nirujjati, ceases, in the original question, the Buddha introduced the significant word uparujjati, to hold in check. After reformulating that monk's question in this way, the Buddha gave the following answer, which, for a long time, has puzzled the scholars. Viññānaṃ anidassaнаṃ anantang sabbatopabhang eta apocha patavi tejo vayo nagadhati eta digancha rassancha anungthulang subhasubhang etha namancha rupancha asesang uparujjhati viññānassa nirodhena ethetang uparujjhati. Consciousness, which is non-manifestative, endless, lustrous on all sides. Here it is that water and earth, fire and air no footing find. Here again is long and short, subtle and gross, comely and ugly. Here is name as well as form, are held in check with no trace left. Wherein consciousness comes to cease, all these are held in check therein. Now let us attempt a solution to this long-standing puzzle. The Buddha is declaring that there is something called anidassana viññāna, non-manifestative consciousness. Since we have already told you about the elusive gem, you can easily guess what anidassana means. Or else, from the Narcissus story, you can get a clue to the meaning of the term anidassana, non-manifestative. For Narcissus, deluded as he was, the water in the pond manifested an angel. Had wisdom dawned on him, the manifestation, the angel, would be no more. Consciousness of an angel would have ceased. So also is the case with the gem in the pond. King Vedeha as well as Senaka had a consciousness of a gem. After Bodhisattva Mahosaddha dispelled the delusion, their consciousness ceased to manifest a gem, and along with that, distinctions based on earth, water, fire, air, long and short, comely and ugly, relating to the reflection of the gem, were gone. So then this is the meaning of the phrase viññānaṃ anidassanam. What is it that the non-manifestative consciousness does not manifest? Whatever that has to do with the perception of form. Thereby the significance of the pairs of words the Buddha tagged on to that monk's question would also become clear. Digancha rassancha anungthulang subhasubhang. Long and short, subtle, gross, comely, ugly. All these distinctions are part and parcel with the perception of form. Finally, it is said that name and form are held in check without residue. That is, by way of summary. But then, what is the meaning of the last two lines? Viññānassa nirodhena ethetang uparujjhati. With the cessation of consciousness, all these are held in check. What is meant is the cessation of the abhisankhata viññāna, the specifically prepared consciousness. In other words, it is the deluded consciousness, for example, the gem consciousness or the angel consciousness in the case of Narcissus. Whatever pertains to the abhisankhata viññāna comes to cease in that all lustrous consciousness, sabbadānaṃ viññāna. When light comes from all directions, consciousness becomes non-manifestative. Viññānaṃ anidassanam anantang sabbadānaṃ. Let us go back to our simile of the film show. When a beautiful film star appears on the screen, one might be tempted to go and embrace her, like Narcissus. The unreality of all what appears on the screen is understood when the cinema hall is fully illuminated. Only the screen is there. The scenes are gone. When Bodhisattva Mahosaddha enlightened them on the point, the king and Senaka understood that there is no gem in the water. All these are clues to the meaning of the phrase viññānaṃ anidassanam. Consciousness becomes non-manifestative when it is endless and lustrous on all sides. What is the luster? Wisdom is the luster. We have pointed this out on many occasions. Some people seem to think that the Buddha compared wisdom to a luster or light only in a metaphorical sense. But that is not so. The Buddha's sermon on lusters, pabbha, is a very powerful one. Chatasso ima bhikkhave pabbha, katama chatasso, chanda pabbha, surya pabbha, aggi pabbha, panya pabbha. Ima ko bhikkhave chatasso pabbha. Etadaggang bhikkhave ima sang chatunnang yadidang panya pabbha. Monks, there are these 4 lusters. What for? The luster of the moon, the luster of the sun, the luster of fire, the luster of wisdom. These, monks, are the 4 lusters. Of these 4, monks, this is the highest, namely, the luster of wisdom. All this time, people took this declaration lightly. It is through this luster of wisdom that this illusory magic show is exposed for what it is. If name in name and form is formal name, and form in name and form is nominal form, it is dependent on such a spurious name and form that the sixfold sense sphere bifurcates into 2 teams, eye and forms, ear and sounds, etc. And then it is as a result of the interplay between these 2 teams that we get a world. That is why the Buddha defined the world in terms of the 6 sense spheres. The entire world is to be found within this duality. Last of all comes the duality of mind and mind objects. It is within this world of the sixfold sense sphere that all those things that we take seriously cease. Some people are scared of the word sunyata, voidness. But one cannot help it. That is why the Buddha compared it to an awakening from a dream. The worldlings are in a dream world. If things seen in a dream are no longer there when one wakes up, there is no point in lamenting. Things non-existing are seen as non-existing. That is, the knowledge of things as they are. Yatha bhutang ñāna. The truth came to light in the light of wisdom. Regarding name and form, there are many significant references well worth quoting. For instance, there are these 2 lines which convey something deep. Tang nama rupasming asajjamanang akinchanang nanupatanti dukkha. That one untrammeled by name and form and possessionless, no pains befall. Not to get entangled in name and form is equivalent to owning nothing. Then there is nothing to get attached to. There is also this revealing declaration. Anattani attamaning passa lokang sadevakang nivittang namarupasming idang sacchanti manyati. Behold the world with all its gods, fancying a self where none exists. Entrenched in name and form, it builds the conceit. This is the truth. Like Narcissus, like Seneca, the world has got entrenched in name and form. That is what the Buddha is pointing out to us. The luster or light we spoke about is not like any form of light known to modern science. It is within this darkness, then, that the forms we see with our eyes and take to be real exist. That is why the Buddha compared all perceptions to a mirage. Let me say something more to the same effect. There is an important discourse on duality we had discussed earlier too. It centers round the following highly significant verse. Yo ubhante viditvana majhe manta nalippati tang brumi mahapurisoti sodha sibbani machaga. This verse, actually found in the Tissametteya Sutta of the Sutta Nibbāna, is so deep in meaning that, according to the Anguttara Nikaya, already during the Buddha's lifetime, monks cited it and gave 6 different interpretations to it in a sort of symposium. Rendered simply, the verse conveys the following idea. Whoever, having known both ends with wisdom, gets not attached to the middle, him do I call a great man. It is he who has gone beyond the seamstress. We have given a long commentary to this verse already. Out of the 6 interpretations, 2 are relevant to our topic today. So we shall limit our discussion to those 2. The common feature in all the 6 interpretations is the positing of 2 things as the 2 ends with something at the middle. The 2 ends are supposed to be stitched up, ignoring the middle, by a seamstress. In one of the 2 interpretations, we propose to discuss one end is nama, name, the second end is rupa, form, and the middle is vijnana, consciousness. Just see, many scholars in defining nama insist on including consciousness also in it. It is utterly wrong. The analysis of nama-rupa in our commentarial tradition is contrary to the law of dependent arising. Here it is clearly stated that name is one end and form is the other end, and that consciousness is in the middle. Craving is the seamstress. What does she do? She ignores the existence of consciousness in the middle and stitches up name and form, making one forget that the very distinction between name and form is due to consciousness. All this shows what a deep understanding those monks had even about one verse where present-day scholars get stuck. 6 monks gave 6 different interpretations to the same verse, and the Buddha ratified all of them, specifying, however, that he himself had the first interpretation in mind when he uttered that verse. It seems that all the 6 interpretations are topics of meditation. So now we have dealt with one of them. Well, there is another meditation topic like that. Only these 2 we are mentioning, as they are relevant to our theme. According to this particular interpretation, one end is the 6 internal sense spheres. The second end is the 6 external sense spheres. As we have already explained, the 6 internal spheres are the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. The 6 external spheres are their objects, the forms, the sounds, the smells, the tastes, the tangibles, and the ideas. They are on either side, and again consciousness is in the middle. But craving puts the knot, just as in the case of name and form. Craving stitches them up into a knot, ignoring consciousness. So also in the case of the sense spheres. For instance, eye and forms are separated, and craving, the seamstress, stitches them up, ignoring consciousness, which is in the middle. Sometimes the difference between consciousness and wisdom is pointed out in the discourses. Their respective functions are also clarified. One such clarification is Panya bhave tabba vijnānaṃ pariññeyaṃ. Wisdom is to be developed. Consciousness is to be comprehended. In fact, the development of wisdom is for the purpose of comprehension of consciousness. As wisdom develops, the nature of consciousness is understood. Now, what does this mean? To understand the nature of a magic show as it is to be free from its spell. That is the end of the magic show. It is the same with the delusion about the cinema screen or the TV screen. When wisdom comes up, consciousness goes down. That is the implication of the phrase viññānasa nirodhena, with the cessation of consciousness. Now you can understand what the cessation is. It is like the cessation of the angel consciousness of Narcissus and the gem consciousness of Seneca. That monk thought that there is some place where the four great primaries cease completely. The Buddha, however, held that what matters is the perception of form derived from the four great primaries, that it is a case of grasping, upadana. It is not a destruction of the four great primaries. If one takes rupa in the materialistic sense, like modern scientists, one cannot understand the deeper implications of these verses. What we have before us is a question of release from this vortical interplay, from the meaningless running in the same circle. Between name and form and consciousness, worldlings keep running round and round in vain. We spoke about an abyss. You can understand this abyss in relation to the whirlpool we have described. It is to fill the vacuum arising out of the abyss that craving and grasping step in with the result. The five aggregates get accumulated. That is like the flotsam and jetsam that the abyss attracts and engulfs. All these implications go with our simile of the vortex. But if one interprets the term vortex as rain, all these deep meanings have no place. The point at which the currents turn back is the full understanding of the vortex. With that, the whirlpool of that individual whirls no more. He cannot be traced any more. The whirlpool or the vortex of the Arahant has ceased. But there is nothing to lament. The whirlpool was in the water. The mainstream too is a body of water. So what has actually ceased is only a pervert notion of existence. Just see, when we interpret these verses in this way, there are some who call it nihilistic. Even the Buddha was branded a nihilist by the Brahmins. In the body of water, flowing downwards, there was a pervert formation called a whirlpool, or a vortex, as a result of a runaway current. Even Buddhas and Paṭicca Buddhas have been so many samsaric runaway water currents. After a vain, vortical interplay for eons and eons, if through wisdom their name and form comes to an end, currents will never flow for them again. You can now understand what sort of a deep Dhamma the Buddha has presented us through this vortex simile. The delusion is seen through by the light of wisdom. That is the path of insight Bodhisattva Vipassi followed. It was when the radical attention, yoniso manasikara, became razor-edge sharp that wisdom dawned on him. That is precisely why there is this significant phrase in that same discourse. Yoniso manasikara ahupanyaya abhisamayo. Through radical attention, there was the understanding through wisdom. So then, radical attention is the seed of wisdom, and also its harbinger. Well, Knowing this innate capacity of attention, the thumb, the Buddha gave him free pardon for the nonce. There is no other way to solve this sansaric riddle but one thing. When attention began exposing the inside story of the plot, confessing his own complicity in it as non-radical attention, something like catching the thief red-handed happened in the end. I shall tell you the whole story later. Why do we say it is like catching the thief red-handed? Because it is due to this guy, attention, that everything in the world becomes a thing. Manasikara sambhava sabbe dhamma. All things have attention as their origin. Everything originates from attention. Attention is the discoverer of the thing. All things are rooted in interest. Chandamulaka sabbe dhamma. There is a very important discourse bearing on this topic which we might have mentioned earlier. The special significance of attention lies in the fact that it makes a thing what it is. That is why the thumb is so important. To anyone in this world, a thing becomes the thing only when his attention picks it up. Isn't that so? Just think about it. Setting aside all your problems, you all are now listening to this sermon. But as soon as you go home, problems crop up again. How? Your attention went there. Attention picks up the problems. When a problem comes up, it is the thing for you. But it is nothing for your neighbor. Your problem has made it the thing for you. Although attention was granted free pardon, when he confesses his part in the plot, it becomes obvious that he is the biggest thief. It is as if he is caught red-handed. What is that he has stolen? The thing, the mind object, mano dhamma. Mind and mind objects constitute the most formidable dyad of all. The other dyads, like eye and forms, ear and sounds, are simple. The subtlest point is where the mind strikes the mind object, Dhamma. That is the most elusive object. What is it that we call what comes to mind? Let me quote from the first verse of the Dhammapada, as usual. Mano pubbangama dhamma, mano seta manomaya. Mind is the forerunner of mind objects. Mind is their chief. They are mind-made. These two lines are found in the two opening verses of the Dhammapada. Until the Buddha came on the scene, everyone thought that things exist in themselves, and that mind comes later. The Buddha, however, pointed out to the world that mind comes first, and things come later. Not only that, manomaya, things are mind-made. That gem in the pond was mind-made. The angel or deity of Narcissus was mind-made. The Buddha proclaimed to the world this nature of phenomena. Modern scientists should ponder over the Buddha's comparison of all perceptions to a mirage. Not only the scientists, but some of our silly people also take up their viewpoint. That is not science, but nescience. If the scientists get a hint to the correct direction, they might understand that they have got stuck somewhere. It is because they started from the wrong end. In the last analysis, they will have to grant the fact that things originate from attention. Manasikara sambhava sabbe dhamma. In the final reckoning, attention is found to be the culprit. What is the reason for attention? Interest, or chanda. In the same discourse, it is said that all things are rooted in interest. Chanda mulaka. Interest is the lightest shade of craving, tanha. That is why the Buddha preached that interest is also the root of the 5 aggregates of grasping. The word chanda has the sense of liking or wanting. It is because of chanda that Narcissus saw an angel and the king saw a gem. So one can understand why the Buddha has preached that in order to attain emancipation, ignorance and craving must be done away with. We have to kill our samsaric mother and father. Craving is the mother and ignorance the father, whom we have to kill according to a riddle verse in the Dhammapada. Mātarang pītarang hantva, having killed the mother and the father. We have come all this long way in samsara because of the hindrance, nivarana, of the father and the fetter, sangyojana, of the mother. That, in short, is the secret of the vortex. Interest is that lightest shade of craving, which comes in almost unknowingly. If you try to keep track of your thoughts, you will find that suddenly a thought breaks in as from nowhere. But if you are sharp enough, you will realize that in some subtle way, as if in a dream, a need or a wanting surfaces. As soon as it arises, it becomes the thing. There is a lot to be said on this point. I have put it in brief. If there is merit in you all, and life in me, perhaps you will get the opportunity to listen to some more sermons like this. So, from what little we have told you, you might understand these things, though scholars may not, since you are now on higher precepts and in a meditative state of mind. We invite you to open up for yourselves the path of insight and realize your higher aspirations. Whatever beings there be, from the lowest hell to the highest Brahma realm, may they all rejoice in our sermon. May the merits in rejoicing conduce to the fulfillment of their higher aims. May you too, as soon as possible, in this very dispensation of the Buddha, understand the 4 Noble Truths through knowledge of the law of dependent arising, and attain the deathless ambrosial Nibbāna. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.